Hello, how is everybody today? Hi. Have you napped after you ate lunch and all of that, so we're all wide awake again?
Yeah, don't nap in here.
Or we'll call on you. So welcome. If you are here to find out what the heck entrepreneurial ecosystem building is and how we do it, then you're in the right place. If you're here for something else, then you might want to look at your itinerary or agenda and see where it is. And we wanted to make sure that we have a conversation with you instead of at you today. So it's going to be a little interactive. And if you all have smartphones and such, we're going to find out who's in the room besides us.
So if you will use your phones, go to menti.com, menti.com. And then you want to enter in the code up at the top of the screen here, 5217 5528. And we'll be asking you a few questions along our session today through this platform.
Okay, so.
Yep,
Okay.
it's
It is
5217 5528, and it's at the top of the screen as well.
all right. And then as you answer, you'll see the bars go up and down, and we'll see who's in the room with us.
And we're wanting you to share with us and with everybody else, what is your primary role in your everyday work, right? Mm-hmm. Are you an entrepreneur, someone that supports entrepreneurs, an investor? Perhaps you support entrepreneurs and provide services? 5217 5528. Or are you an educator or a researcher? Looks like we got a lot of supporters in here. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks that engage with and support entrepreneurs. It's fantastic. Who has multiple roles? Multiple things. Yeah, fantastic. Great to see.
Spinning lots of plates, right? So.
And then we'll ask you as well this. Do you consider yourself an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder? Yes, no, or unsure, because you don't know what the heck it is, and that's why you're here.
Okay, and you should still be able to do it on the same link. If you refresh the page, then it should bring you to that. And see, most of the people here. And if you're not sure, that's absolutely fine. I didn't know what the heck it was. Somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're an ecosystem builder," and I thought, the heck is that? And they said, you help people navigate and find resources and find the next steps. And I said, oh, you mean the stuff I do for free? Like, that's a thing? And they said, yes. So, here we are. But one of the reasons that this session is actually called what it is because this is the question that we get asked all the time. What the heck is it? And how do we do it? So. We'll share.
Yeah, so we've been doing this work together, and we'll share a little bit more about how we got here in just a minute. But there's a colleague of ours who works in the field of entrepreneurial ecosystem building. And after getting asked this so many times, and you'll meet him, his name is Andy Stoll, he works for the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation out of Kansas City in the U.S. You'll meet him tomorrow at a session. If you are here.
Friday. He will be at a session on Friday. If you meet Andy, I would love for you to go up to Andy and say, "Ooh, you're the cool voice on that video that I saw." Okay? So just go up. He's the nicest person, and
we'll share the video. And just to say, he did the voice on this because no one can do it the way he does it. And so if you will play.
Okay.
An entrepreneurial ecosystem is all the resources that surround entrepreneurs as they move their business forward. Ecosystem building is about getting those resources and folks in the community to work together by creating an environment of trust and collaboration, supporting big ideas, supporting people when they take risks, supporting people when they fail, creating that right culture that is ripe for entrepreneurial success. Because of the changing nature of our economy and our communities, we have to take new approaches in ways that will make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate. Traditional ways of supporting entrepreneurs looked at the individual parts of an ecosystem. Ecosystem builders take a systems view. They put entrepreneurs front and center in that system, and they say, how can I make our community more supportive of entrepreneurs of all types? So the role of an ecosystem builder is really a systems leader. It really takes leaders stepping up who care about the whole system and not just the individual parts of the ecosystem. Entrepreneurial ecosystem builders come from economic development, community development, libraries, universities. They come from different sectors. They could be entrepreneurs themselves. Anyone who cares about the success of entrepreneurs in their community. The challenge is that there's thousands of people that are working on building their entrepreneurial ecosystem, but they were doing it what I would call custom and bespoke ways. There's very little consensus on some basic elements. How do we create the environment in which entrepreneurs in our community can thrive? What are the processes? What are the steps? How do you build an ecosystem? How do you measure the health of an ecosystem? And I think as that practice of ecosystem building matures, it becomes more available to more communities. The only way we're going to figure out how to do this is to figure it out together.
So that lovely video was the product of a couple of years of work around the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation. In 2017, they put out an invitation. 450 people came together. We didn't know what the heck it was. I probably knew less than a handful of people in the room. I thought I got invited because I was the lead organizer at 1 Million Cups, which is an entrepreneurial meetup that's funded by the Kauffman Foundation. And I thought they invited all the 1 Million Cups organizers, and they actually only invited 10. And then I said, you know, I'm a bootstrapping entrepreneur. I'm broke. I can't come to your conference. And they said, oh, we'll give you a scholarship. And I thought, oh, multi-billion-dollar foundation. They paid for everybody. And they didn't. They only invited and supported about a dozen of us to come to this meeting. And I walked into the room. I had no clue what it was. But again, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, you're an ecosystem builder. Lucky for me, that happened to be the Marion Kauffman the foundation. So I walked into the room and met what was soon to be some of my favorite people and the people I'm in the trenches with. And we got together and we started ideating on what the heck an ecosystem is. So that's basically how I got involved. I was in corporate America in the travel industry for more than 20 years. I got fired from a soul-sucking job, jumped headfirst into entrepreneurship, and along the way, I met people who said, hey, you have an idea. You should meet so-and-so. Or have you thought about this? Or do you know about this program? And little by little, I found out that there were people working, in Andy said, custom and bespoke ways to support founders in their communities. So that's how I got started. And I was fortunate enough that when the Kauffman Foundation decided to bring on people to support this ecosystem building effort, a year down the line, I was tapped for that job. And I went from bootstrapping entrepreneur that never launched to beginning this movement in a made-up job called ecosystem building. And now I get to do this globally.
Hello. My name is Fay Horwitt. I am the president and CEO of an organization called Forward Cities. And we work across the US, across 50+ communities now, helping them catalyze more equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. So our work is really focused around how do we help communities close the racial wealth gap by transforming the way they see, support, and sustain entrepreneurs. And I also tripped into this work. I was a frustrated entrepreneur. I showed up at a startup weekend, and anyone's heard of startup weekends? I showed up there and walked into the room, and there were 50-some folks. There were, of the 50, only 5 were people of color, and I was the only black woman in the room. And at the end of the first day, after I pitched a women's marketing company idea, and they all looked at me like I was crazy in the room because it wasn't tech, and I realized, oh, I felt like I belonged there. But I stayed, and I made a lot of contacts, and I learned about lean startup, and I learned, what was possible, and the gaps between what small businesses are told, small business entrepreneurs are told versus what startup entrepreneurs are told, and the difference in gaps between the resources that they're given and provided, and the gaps in education. And I was really intrigued by that work. I wanted to see, what I could do to make a difference. So I put my business idea on hold. It was probably a good thing because it was not going to go anywhere anyway. But then I decided this is the work I want to do. I want to help other entrepreneurs that show up in spaces like that and don't feel like that they belong and don't feel like that they're supported. And I began to lean into that work and learn more about it. And then I began to understand as well that there were similar gaps for the organizations that were supporting those entrepreneurs. They didn't get the same funding, they didn't get the same access to resources, they were not treated equitably. And so I began to sort of hunt. This is my hometown in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I began to hunt for help. How could I help my community do this work better? And I began Googling, and I found 2 organizations that were doing this work. One was the Kauffman Foundation, and the other was an organization called Forward Cities. And I ended up joining Forward Cities. It's been now almost 5 years. I came in as Director of Community Engagement. I am now the CEO of the organization, guiding its strategy and our work around the country. And along the way, as I said, the Kauffman Foundation became one of our core funders of the work that we do. And this ecosystem building work, even though we tripped into it, it touched on everything that that has embodied how I function as an individual. I think about the people first. I think about the entrepreneur first. What is their lived experience? How are they getting to their resources? How are they finding out what's available? Listening to their needs, putting them before the needs of the service providers, which you'd think would be natural, but sometimes it's not. And that's sort of how I landed in this work and how I met Cecilia. That question, what the heck is entrepreneurial ecosystem building? The honest answer is we don't know. Because we are still figuring it out. Mm-hmm. It is an emerging field, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today is how we kind of see it. Because you can ask 100 ecosystem builders, and they will all tell you 100 different things that they think it is.
And I think that that's the case when you ask what's an entrepreneur, right? We have our own answers for what that is. So ecosystem building for me, and first I guess I should introduce myself because my boss would like that. So my name is Cecilia Wessinger. I'm the Director for Global Community for the Global Entrepreneurship Network. And as I've done this work nationally with the Kauffman Foundation and a little bit globally, I now get to do this on a bigger level. We work with about 180 countries around the world, and we touch on all the aspects of the entrepreneurial compass. So that's our compass. And it reminds us that we have an investment track where we have a global business angel network with over 65 countries represented and work with major angel networks. We have an accelerate program with mentors and programming to do that. We do the global version of 1 Million Cups called Startup Huddle, where people get together and tap into the hive mind. We also work with the ecosystem building practitioners. We work with researchers and policymakers around the world, and we have 2 flagship programs. One is our convening. Our next convening will be in Melbourne in September, and we're the organization that supports Global Entrepreneurship Week, which is the week in November where the world comes together and celebrates entrepreneurship, and that takes place involving about 10 million people, 40,000 events, 20,000 organizations. We don't do all the work. All the work is done by everybody else. We just help to amplify and elevate that. So if you have any questions about those, I'm happy to talk about that. For me personally, ecosystem building is the intersection between economic development, community building, and workforce. I think that sometimes when we talk about entrepreneurship, we forget that there are other people besides the founders that work in these organizations. And what does that look like? And how all these big industries started out as baby industries, and what does that look like in the evolution of it all? So it's all of how that comes together. And I think that right now, and I'm skipping ahead on the things that we agreed to talk about, but I think that in conferences like this and people that talk around founders and entrepreneurship, we tend to focus on high tech, high growth, venture backable, the sexy. And there's a tendency to use the word community synonymous with ecosystems. And so in my definition of an ecosystem, which has a nuanced difference than a community, there's a lot of startup communities out there. To me, the metric of success of a startup community is very different at times than an entrepreneurial ecosystem. When I think about ecosystems, they're a symbiotic relationship. How does one thing work with another or in tandem or catalyze something else? We're like the mycelium, that invisible network of mushrooms where you don't see the connections and the bonds, but they're interconnected, and something happens here and it affects something down there. Or a stand of aspen trees. Aspens don't grow on their own. They grow in a stand, and they grow together. And sometimes things die off, and sometimes they flourish. Victor Huang, who was the vice president of entrepreneurship at the time that I was consulting at the foundation, he wrote a book called The Rainforest and talked about how the rainforest, you can't tell the cash crop from the weed, right? So you're just going to have to nourish everything, and some things will die, and some things will succeed. And the things that die help to feed and nourish, and you pass on that learning to the next thing. So it's my very long answer to what does an ecosystem mean for me.
Yeah, I see it a little bit differently because we do different sets of work. As we were doing this work in different communities around the U.S., one of the things that we kept hearing and seeing is that people who were interested in supporting the ecosystem, they tended to fall in three categories. There were a group of people that were really interested in entrepreneurs. How do we make sure that entrepreneurs have the capital access that they need? How do we make sure they have the education that they need? Market opportunities. And it was both the investment and the time. People wanted to focus on entrepreneurs. Then there was another group of people who were really interested in how do we make sure there's enough organizations, how do we make sure there's enough sort of education and resources to directly support entrepreneurs? So what does that layer look like, right? Are there organizations to meet all the needs for each sector of entrepreneur? Is there enough sort of funding to make sure that each stage and sector of entrepreneur is supported? Is there enough capacity building or capacity and opportunities for those organizations to grow and thrive? And then lastly, there was the ecosystem level. And this was this nebulous piece around how do all these things connect? And what's the flow between them, right? Is it working well? Are there barriers? Are there challenges? And that's in particular the work that we were looking at, is these systems are designed, ecosystems are supposedly natural. They supposedly have a natural flow. But we all know in natural ecosystems there are barriers. There are things that get broken. There are things that sort of break down and that sort of get damaged. And those things don't necessarily heal themselves. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have to be intentional about correcting them. So you have to understand the system first to know what's working and what's not working. So that's the ecosystem layer. So we came up with this concept called E3. That if you are going to build an equitable entrepreneurial ecosystem, you had to make sure that there was equity on all those three levels. And that the people who were working within the ecosystem were in their right place in that framework and in that structure, and that they were all working together. And then the next thing we discovered is that people would say, well, how do we do it, right? What are the things that need to be done to build an ecosystem? And the way we started thinking about this, a lot of people thought about this as, in terms of time bound. oh, well, you bring the people together, and then you map your assets, and then you come together and have a conversation, and then you have events, and then you get the capital flow. And we began to see that you can't do it sequentially like that. It does not work. Everything has to be happening all at once. So we broke it down into what are the activities? What are the things that need to be going on all the time? And these are the things that ecosystem builders do that no one else can do. And so asset mapping, and we love all of the
platforms?
The platforms, but yeah, making it easy for people to remember. So E3, but then we've got the 6 A's, which is asset mapping, right? Assessment, so surveys, focus groups, talking to entrepreneurs, getting that information. So you want to map your assets, you want to assess the health and equity of your ecosystem. Next is alignment. Once you know what the assets are and you've assessed what the health and equity is, then you begin to align you need to align all the players. All of that needs to be happening simultaneously. Then the biggest thing that people don't get to is action. We're not just going to sit around and talk. We're not going to sit around and someone says in a room, oh, my organization's doing this. Will you come support us? And someone else on the other side, our organization's having this event. Will you come and support us? And it's more than that. You've got to be doing things together. You've got to be building trust with one another and figuring out, are there duplications? Are there gaps? Who's doing too much of one thing? Do you have enough money in all parts of the ecosystem? And then action, there's also advocacy. Who is making sure that there is money and that there's policy to support the ecosystem? And then lastly, the last A is amplification. Who is telling the stories? Who is sort of uplifting what's happening along the way? All 6 of these things need to be happening all along the way. And so Forward Cities thinks about this work in terms of layers, who's doing it, the 3 E's, and then what they do, the 6 A's.
So those are easy to remember right now. There'll be a test afterwards. Actually, so to step on the side and go back to the video and what you saw, when those 450 people initially came together in a room, it wasn't called ecosystem building. It was, but it wasn't, and we were just having these conversations. And the conversation initially was, if this were to be a thing, what would it need to be? And out of the conversations that came out of that first eShip Summit, what we realized was there was a lot of main goals or pillars that you had to think about. And it is a systems level thing. Also, there's a difference between complex and complicated. I want to say that this work is definitely complex, okay? There are many different layers, there's many different phases, all of that stuff. So it's a lot. It's complicated in a way because it's around people, right? But as we put together these pillars, what we ended up doing was we mirrored it after the UN Sustainable Goals. So 17 goals of the world will implode. We had 7 eShip goals. And if we can work towards these 7 goals, then we can move something forward. So the 7 eShip goals, we start first and foremost with inclusion. And inclusion is baked into everything that we do. If you are not intentionally inclusive, you will be unintentionally exclusive. Because that's all you know. We're an affirmation bias species. Actually, affinity is something that all species move towards. So it's easy to go towards people like you, right? And when you get the same people in the room together, it becomes this siloed kind of think tank, and everybody's affirming each other because your idea is like my idea, so I think it's a thumbs up. But then you don't have that diversity of thought. So inclusive field. The second one is a collaborative culture. You have to want to work together because it's natural for us to go off and do the thing by ourselves. It's easier that way. But that collaborative culture is what brings people together. There's a shared mission and a vision. So that's your moonshot. That's your goal towards what are we doing all together. And besides the shared mission and vision, Inside of those are things like the vernacular that you use. When you say entrepreneurship and I say entrepreneurship, are we almost aligned, right? That understanding of what it is. So that's why it was important for us to share our personal definitions of ecosystem. It doesn't mean that it has to be yours, but whoever it is you're collaborating with, you should be in some kind of alignment. Otherwise, you're building something, they're building something, and you think you're working on the same thing because you use the same words, and they don't necessarily mean the same things to all people. So besides inclusive field, collaborative culture, shared vision, you've got connected networks. We tend to work in silos. And sometimes the silos are good because that's where you laser focus and get stuff done. The problem is there's no communication between the silos. So if you permeate the silos, so you can look over there and go, oh, I see what you're doing. I'm doing something similar. Would you like to collaborate? Or you know what? You're taking care of something, and I see that we're overlapping, so I'm just going to pivot and do something else, right? So permeating silos helps to transfer information back and forth. Then we have metrics and methods. Metrics are not the same as methods, which are not the same as goals, which are not the same as KPIs. They're all nuanced differences, but all of those are going to be really important because if you can't measure where you are and where you want to go, then you'll keep going around in circles. Then we have universal support, which is how do you let other people know what's going on? Maybe it's letting people know that there's a startup weekend, right? Or getting in touch with your policymakers and saying you've got an initiative. How do you get those people that are not already in the room to feel like they're included and invited into doing things alongside you? Otherwise, it just becomes like this oligarchy, right? And then you've got sustainable work. And that's where sometimes we fall short because it was that stuff that Fay and I did for free. And you burn out fast. And I have this aversion to give before you get. I think a lot of people are really champions of the idea. It sounds very benevolent, but I've seen so many people burn out because they gave before they got. And sometimes you got to put your own oxygen mask on first, right? If you're not nourishing yourself, then how do you know? The other thing is it's a little pretentious to think that the world is going to want what you got to give. Sometimes you want to sit in the room and find out what's going on before you jump in and start giving. So I would say it's like the Brady Bunch mentality, right? Sometimes you give, sometimes you get, sometimes you hang out and figure out what's going on. So woven into all those 7 goals is storytelling. Because storytelling opens up hearts and minds. It's not a separate goal, but it's baked in. So when you talk about metrics and methods, your storytelling of that would be like your case studies. If you're talking about universal support, that's like a public service announcement. You know, so those things are all woven in. How you tell the story is very important. So remember, storytelling opens up hearts and minds, and it's the metrics and data that's going to open up checkbooks and wallets. So those are the 7 E-ship goals. And we thought we were onto something because we invited, along the couple of years that we worked on this, about 12 to 1,500 entrepreneurial ecosystem builders to talk about this stuff. So we figured that we had the answers. It's a great framework, but it's a framework, not the framework. And so I want to be really careful about the fact that you use it to apply to what it is that you're working on and use the things, the tools that work for you. You do not have to incorporate or adapt to every single thing. Every ecosystem is different. It is not scale replication. It's not like the franchise model. What works here is going to work there. It's really about the things that work in your community are going to work in your community. And can you scale it? Can you grow it? Depends.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify to the goals that you mentioned. That's for the ecosystem building field, right?
Yes.
So this is how we think about growing more people who are doing ecosystem building work. How are we sort of engaging and connecting as ecosystem builders and sort of growing the concepts and this practice across the world? Yes.
And so I'm a big advocate of entrepreneur-focused ecosystem builder-led economic development. And the difference between that, in my opinion, and entrepreneur-led is, you think about your average entrepreneur, they're very head down, right? They have one goal. Their goal is to get their product to market and generate revenue and do whatever it is they're going to do with that thing. So entrepreneurs are focused on what they need to do. They're not looking out for the whole system. It is really the ecosystem builders that have a field level view and are seeing where the gaps are and where things have opportunities, where entrepreneurs are focused down. We keep the entrepreneurs front and center when we talk about what our focus is, but we are definitely, I'm an advocate for ecosystem builder led, because who else is going to connect the dots?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's important for this conversation, that was important for both of us, is what is the common thread? No matter how you are building your ecosystem, no matter how many different frameworks and ways that we've seen this done, or however it's being done, there's a common thread that we see, and that is inequity. There are barriers. I think about it as there are barriers. There's biases. There's bureaucracy. There are things that are all kinds of obstacles that are keeping everyone from being able to participate in the entrepreneurial economy in an equal and equitable way. And we both do work around making sure that that happens. And I think I'd like to sort of dive in a little bit around what are some of the common obstacles that we're seeing around equitable entrepreneurship. So do you want to share what you're seeing?
So as far as equity, well, actually, I'm gonna invite you to talk about the framework, because I'm certified in diversity, equity, inclusion. So I think about things where I work for a global community, right? And I have to remember that not everybody that we work with is a native English speaker. So Global Entrepreneurship Network is a lot of letters to spell out. But if I don't spell it out, I'm making the assumption that when I say Jen, you know what the heck I'm talking about, right? And so that's a bias, and that's how you exclude people. When you talk alphabet soup, when we talk about ROI, ASAP, FYI, all of those things that we take for granted, understand that not everybody understands it the way you do. So those kinds of those things really affected and opened up, to me, the realization that, you know what, not everybody's going to do things my way, or not everybody thinks like me. So those perceptions and perspectives are really important. And Fay's organization has a framework around this diversity, equity, inclusion work that's really made me think beyond what I learned about when it comes to unconscious bias and microaggressions and all that other stuff. So will you share about Abide?
Sure. You know, one of the things that we begin to observe, you know, in doing this work is people, first of all, people used to talk about diversity, right? And diversity it's great. Diversity happens by accident, though. It's who walks in the room, right? It is just what it is. Who walked in here? How diverse are we as a group? That's passive, right? Then people begin to talk about inclusion. And that is, let's say we're all sitting here and someone came to the door and they poked in and we said, hey, can I come in? Sure, come on in. And people will say, everyone's welcome, right? The door is open, you can come in, but that's not enough, because what it's also doing, hey, come on in. You are welcome. What inclusion does is it actually maintains the power in the dominant group, because then you're basically saying that we have the right to say who can and cannot enter the room, and we don't, right? So inclusion is also limited in what it can accomplish. And so then people begin to think about equity. Okay, well, equity, people really misunderstand what it means, right? You don't dig in. But what equity is about is saying, hey, we have not been let's say we weren't letting women into the rooms. Let's say there was a sign on the door that said no women allowed, right? And let's say everyone in here was men. Now, equity would mean on the door saying, at least for a couple hours, only women can come in. Because what that does is that will allow us to balance the room. And then at some point we can say, hey, okay, now everyone can come in, right? Equity is about being compensatory. It's about making sure that you are correcting for the problem that created the inequity in the first place, right? And so these are the terms, DEI, that are frequently used in our work in sort of corporate settings these days and in startups. So got to have DEI policy. Great, write up your policy. That's step one, right? And then what we begin to think about is when you're talking about entrepreneurship and you're talking about access to capital, there's a couple of other things that we felt was important. So access, right? Access is about, okay, the room is here, people can come in and cannot, but guess what? Everybody may not be able to fit through that door. And what if there were no seats left, right? Then what do we do? Okay, we have to do things very intentionally to make sure that everyone can get into the room, right? Make sure that everyone has equal access. And then the last one is really important. This is something that gets missed, and it's really important in ecosystems. And this is belonging. And that is, once I'm in the room, I feel like that what is being presented, what is being shared, what is being offered, it takes me into account. Someone has been mindful and thoughtful to ensure that they are designing whatever it is with me in mind, right? And I'm going to give you another sort of easy to remember acronym, and that is ABIDE. Access, belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity. And that is sort of the way we think about how we build equitable ecosystems. We want to make sure anytime you are designing something for entrepreneurs, starting a program, starting a fund, launching an incubator, having a pitch competition, if you think about ABIDE and you go down and check the lists, it's a good plumb line for you to make sure that you are making sure that everyone has an equal part.
So that belonging is being able to show up authentically, unapologetically like yourself. And that sometimes means dissent. That's that gnawing thing that happens. Trouble happens. It's messy. Ecosystem building has been at this messy middle. I want to also be mindful of time, and I don't know if we have time for questions, but we can try to collect some. But we're happy to talk to you afterwards. So because I got this sign that we're wrapping up on time. So,
Yes.
So the messiness, right, is where the top down and then the bottom up meet in that messy middle. That's where we sit. And when we sit in that messy middle, sometimes all that energy starts to dissipate. And sometimes you get cranky people. And there's the whole idea of like waiting till the right people are at the table or the right people are in the room. I'll tell you who the right people are. The right people are the ones that showed up. Because they took the initiative and they put in the effort and they showed up. And sometimes what you need to do is invite all the rest of those right people along with you. Keep them abreast of what you're doing, but the train leaves the station. Otherwise, we sit there and we continue to wait for something to happen. Well, that something is you. So I would invite you to get started. Let people know what's going on. Send out more information, right? We did this, we met, we talked about this, and we're going to keep going. And then you get that friction. Hey, I don't think we're headed in the right direction. And so the natural tendency has been to quiet the dissent. If we quiet the dissent, the problem goes away. No, that's not true. People go away. The problem stays, and it'll rear its ugly head again, right? So what you want to do is figure that out. And I'm going to tell you that a lot of us are focused on those outputs and outcomes. It's the doing that's going to get you to so much more than you think is possible. Because if you can build the right culture, if you can build the ecosystem that you want so everyone can flourish, then you'll be able to conquer anything that comes in your way. because you're already working together. So together is better, right? And it's a matter of people plus culture equals everything. That's my favorite equation. If you can get the people to work together, get the culture right, then anything is possible. So
yeah, if you had any questions, I don't know how much time we have left. If maybe raise your hand if you have a question or reflection.
Thanks for hanging out,
Yes,
Kristen.
thank you.
Kristen with Arizona State University. She's.
You had a.
I have so many questions and reflections. We have a movement in Alberta called the Rainforest Movement, based on Victor Wang and Fay Horwitt's book. And it was started when the tech sector kind of began to flourish and start to blossom here in Alberta. Over the years, exactly to what you're talking about, there has been that descent where there's been so much growth in the ecosystem that it's really hard to maintain that momentum of this culture we've attempted to build around trust and inclusion and all that.
Yeah.
I know doing is part of it, and taking those who want to go for the ride with you, and we talk about it all the time, so everything you're saying is resonating, so you. But it's also just like a constant, slog.
Yes. So it's hard. I don't want to tell you people it's easy. It's not. And I'll tell you what saves us is each other, right? And I had a friend of mine send me a note. She was sent this note by another ecosystem builder. So we talk about burnout because that's the big fear, that people are just going to keep trying to do the thing. And it says, the cure for burnout is not self-care. It's all of us caring for each other. We can't do it alone, and we need each other. You cannot build an ecosystem by yourself. That's an ecosystem. So understand that if you're doing it alone and nobody else wants to go with you, there's probably a problem with that, right?
Yeah. I think, are we?
Yep, I
We need
think
to let
we're.
folks go?
Yep.
Oh.
I just have one quick question. So I'm for sure an ecosystem builder in the entrepreneur space, and it seems that with all organizations, when we do the community asset mapping, all that stuff, we cannot keep on top of the changes.
Yes.
And you won't.
Do you have any suggestions, like cadence of what you do to stay on top of it? Or
You know what? I will tell you, don't get sucked into this idea of you got to have a platform to do that, because nobody's going to take the time to put the stuff in. So the way I see it is relationships. It all comes down to talking regularly, one-on-one, asking, hey, what's happening? What's new? And just having a slate of maybe 10 people that you connect with regularly. And if they also have another 10 people that they connect with regularly, you'll begin
It is a people thing.
You just stay in the loop.
So, we end up having lunch. And you get a bunch of people together and you say, what are you doing? Oh, you know what? We've got this. Or
Or
I
a
have
beer.
a problem. Or whatever
Or
floats
two.
your boat.
Yes.
Or
10.
getting together at conferences. And one of the things that we build in intentional time for at conferences is connecting. Because those conversations that you'll have out there will carry you probably longer than all the stuff that we say from up here. So, and we're around for a little bit if you'd like to talk, but we will give the room and the microphones back to people.